Hello, my name's Guy Salt from SME Solicitors. I'm a partner in the firm and I'm the head of the employment department. I'm going to be talking about flexible working, which covers not just flexible hours, but also home working and hybrid working. And by hybrid working, I mean when people work sometimes in the workplace and also sometimes at home. During the lockdown, in the recent pandemic, the level of hybrid working and home working increased. A lot of this was due to the ability to use technology and have remote access to computer services from home or elsewhere. Obviously, that meant businesses generally felt that actually it could work more and better than they thought it could before the lockdown, and therefore since that time, flexible working has become more prevalent. As a result of this, in 2021, the government put out a consultation process to find out if this was something that could be legislated more for in the future, to help people, say, who had childcare responsibilities, to work more in businesses. The government published the response recently, and some changes were made and proposed. Before I go on to those, I think it's best to talk about the current position. The current position is that an employee can request flexible working after 26 weeks of continuous employment for their employer only. They can only make one request in a 12-month period, and the employer currently has 3 months to respond to that request. Any request must be in writing and it has to contain certain information as set out by statute. One of the biggest problems for employees was one aspect of information that did need to be included was in relation to what effect their request, if granted, would have upon the employer, which you can imagine was very difficult for an employee to deal with. The employer at the moment does not have to consider any alternative proposals with regard to flexible working compared to what the employee has requested. In relation to its response, the employer has 8 potential reasons to turn down the request. In its manifesto before the recent election, the government said that it was going to make flexible working the default option. That means that any employee could have flexible working if they wished, unless there was a specific reason why not. So the presumption was flexible working would operate. This is now not going to happen, but some changes will take effect through legislation that is going to be put through Parliament, but it will take some time. The proposed changes are that from day one, you'll be able to request flexible working. So you won't have to wait for 26 weeks of continuous employment before you can do it. The employer will now be obliged to consider alternative options and not just the one put forward by the employee. ACAS has also introduced a code of practice which states that an employer will need to discuss a request with an employee. And you also remember that I said the current situation is that an employee can only make one request in a 12-month period. This is now going to be increased to 2 requests. An employer also previously only had to respond within 3 months, but now an employer has to respond within 2 months. There is also no need now for an employee to get over that difficult hurdle of saying how it is going to deal with the effect of the request, if granted, upon an employer. There is also a consideration going out in relation to whether a time-limited request can be made under the current framework. And by a time-limited request, I mean something to cover attendance at medical appointments, for example. So that thinking about how to deal with it in relation to what they would call an informal flexible working request. The difficulty we have with this legislation coming in is that there is no clear timeline in relation to when it's going to happen. And also, without getting into the nitty-gritty of how Parliament works, it's going to come in by primary and secondary legislation. By primary legislation, I mean something that has to go through Parliament before it is passed. Secondary legislation doesn't have to go through Parliament. For all those changes I have mentioned, every single change will have to go through Parliament, apart from the one in relation to a day one request being available, i.e. not having to have 26 weeks of continuous employment before making the flexible working request. It is important to note that as far as an employer is concerned, the 8 potential business grounds that are available for rejection remain. For example, saying that the employer does not have the staff to cover the changes in relation to hours, or the effect upon the productivity of the workforce or the business generally. Clearly, the pandemic and the lockdown and people working at home more has shown that businesses can cope more with flexible working than they thought. And I think we're going to see, and probably already have, more requests for flexible working being made. Parents with childcare responsibilities, for example, may be keen to make flexible working requests. Like it or not, more women generally have childcare responsibilities than men, and therefore, if flexible working requests are turned down, there may be an indirect sex discrimination claim from women for these purposes by saying it has a disproportionate effect upon them. Also, in these circumstances, an employer would then have to consider whether they could objectively justify their reason for turning down the request. So, to sum up, there has been some movement. It's not clear when those changes are going to come in, and certainly groups representing employees think it isn't quite enough, essentially because the employer can still rely on one of the 8 business reasons for turning down the request in the first place. If you want to have more information about what you've heard me talk about, then please contact us. The same applies if you want a copy of the slides.